Close your eyes. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath fall into rhythm. The day can drift away now. You're safe here, cradled in stillness. Feel the warmth of your blanket like the embrace of a mountain, solid, patient, and quiet. Do you hear it? A soft wind, a distant drip, the tender crackle of something ancient stirring. This is the quiet only night knows, and that's where our story begins. Our story begins deep in the Misty Mountains, where light is never loud and even echoes whisper. Here lives a dwarf named Gorlin, a quiet soul with eyes like polished smoke and hands that felt stone more deeply than any words could ever describe. He was not a warrior or a treasure seeker. He was a listener, a shaper of chambers. Deep in his people's history, there existed a nearly forgotten craft, echo-sculpting. The ancestral voices of the mountain humming lullabies when shaped with love and patience. Gorlin didn't carve for beauty, but for resonance. Archways that whispered, chambers that sighed. He could spend a full year on a single curve of stone. Visitors to his halls left not with riches, but with a warmth in their chest. It felt as if the mountain whispered my name, said one. Gorlin only nodded. That was exactly the point. One day, Gorlin found a sealed chamber. No maps marked it, no sounds except a faint heartbeat in the stone. He uncovered the doorway gently, and inside was a basin of granite, pale and smooth. In the center, a hollow, small as a child's hand. He placed his fingers there and felt a ripple, soft and ancient. The mountain was speaking, not with words, but with breath. Gorlin sat in the chamber, listening with his body. Tones came slowly, some low, some bright, carried like dew on stone. A song with no voice, a memory without sorrow. He didn't need to understand it with words. It was enough to be still and to let the mountain remember through him. That evening, Gorlin lit his lantern early. Its pale blue glow danced gently, casting sleepy shadows along the stone walls. He walked softly in wool-lined boots, deeper into the heart of his home. He entered a spiral-shaped room, the cradle, built for silence, made for lullabies, and in his hand, a new chisel of rare ore meant not to strike, but to listen. With a whisper, Gorlin placed the chisel to the stone. A soft note bloomed, pure, low, like breath. Then, unexpectedly, the stone replied, a warm vibration, a memory of a lullaby his mother once sang. The wall had remembered what he had long forgotten. Gorlin did not carve that night. He sat cross-legged in the spiral, tools set aside. The chamber sang gently, like a tide in the dark. Its tones held him, not with arms, but with memory. The echo of his past became a blanket of sound. He dreamed of halls made of moonlight. Footsteps echoed melodies, some laughter, some sighs, all soft. Rooms glowed with bedtime stories, children's giggles, and humming voices. No lyrics, only feeling. Walls alive with memory, but never heavy, only warm. When Gorlin awoke, a tear traced his cheek, but it wasn't sadness. The mountain still sang, gently and alive. He whispered thanks for the memory the stone had kept safe. As tea steamed by the fire, a breeze stirred through the hall, and again the lullaby returned, soft and eternal. Later that week, Gorlin returned to the hollowed chamber with a bundle of dried moss, and a small stone bowl filled with clear mountain water. He placed the bowl in the basin's center and waited. When the wind stirred through the narrow tunnels above, it passed over the water's surface, creating a trembling hum, thin, wavering, almost not there. But the moss along the walls began to vibrate softly in response, as if it, too, remembered the lullaby. Gorlin closed his eyes, letting the gentle resonance seep into his chest like warmth from a low fire. He began crafting new chambers, not vast ones, but cozy alcoves carved like cupped hands. Each was tuned to a different note, a different feeling. The hush of snowfall, the warmth of a mother's voice, the softness of a farewell never spoken aloud. These were not places of display or grandeur. They were sanctuaries, places where miners and wanderers could pause and breathe, where echoes wrapped around the weary like a favorite old blanket. One evening, a young dwarf named Tira came to Gorlin's hall. Her boots scuffed from travel, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. She said nothing, only placed her hand on the stone wall. The note it sang in reply was deep and slow, almost like a heartbeat. Tira's shoulders fell. She sat silent for a long while. When she rose to leave, she bowed not out of formality, but from something softer. A kind of thank you too old for words. In the weeks that followed, more came. A bard whose voice had grown hoarse found a room that hummed gently in harmony with his breath. A child who had never spoken laid her cheek against the echo stone and laughed for the first time. None of them stayed long, but all left changed, as if the mountain had whispered something meant only for them. Gorlin simply watched, quiet and content, the guardian of these invisible threads. One night, as winter curled its fingers around the mountains, Gorlin sat in the deepest chamber, the first one he had ever shaped. He set down his chisel, now worn smooth with time, and listened not to the mountain, but to the stillness it offered. It sounded like a breath before sleep, like the hush of snow settling outside a warm home, like something sacred and ordinary all at once. And as his eyes closed, the echoes swelled around him, holding him gently like the voice of a story almost finished, but not quite. The mountain grew colder, but Gorlin's halls grew warmer, not with heat, but with presence. The echoes had deepened, thickened like honey in the air. Some said they heard music when no instruments played. Others claimed to dream more vividly within those walls. But Gorlin knew the truth. The stone was remembering. Each footstep, each breath, each quiet thought layered gently into the rock like sediment, forming slow, invisible songs that would outlast every visitor. That kind of memory needed no words. One dawn, frost etched pale veins across the outer corridors. Gorlin wrapped himself in wool and descended into a tunnel few dared explore. He had heard a tone just once coming from below, like a bell tolling underwater. The passage narrowed, then widened unexpectedly into a hidden dome, smooth and untouched. At the center lay a shard of obsidian resting on an altar of ash-gray stone. He approached, listening. The shard did not speak, but it reflected something, a shimmer of his own face, aged and young at once, a mirror of all his silent years. He stayed in that dome for 3 days. He drank little, carved nothing, only listened. The stone whispered of other echo-sculptors, long vanished, of those who tuned caverns before language existed. Their songs were simpler than thunder, rain, heartbeat. Gorlin understood. He added no new notes, only laid one palm on the wall, closing his eyes, letting his breath become part of the song already there. When he left, he did so softly, stepping backward as if not to wake something sacred. Back in his main hall, he began drawing new patterns in charcoal, spirals not for form, but for flow. Sound needed to move, not bounce. So he carved slow, winding paths through the rock, like the way rivers learn to bend around stones instead of breaking them. In these passageways, echoes did not fade, they layered. A whisper at one end could arrive at the other, rounder, fuller, like a voice matured by memory. Even silence had a shape now. He walked these halls alone, sometimes humming, sometimes not, but always listening. As the snows thickened outside, Gorlin invited no one, yet visitors still came. They came not for him, but for what the walls remembered. Some knelt, some wept, some simply stood still, breathing as if they'd finally arrived somewhere they'd never known they needed. And Gorlin, standing in the shadows beyond the torchlight, would smile faintly. He had become not the sculptor of sound, but the keeper of stillness. And in that stillness, something ancient stirred, a kind of peace that held the soul like arms at rest. Spring returned slowly to the mountains, like soft fingers brushing frost from stone. Meltwater trickled through cracks, making quiet music of its own, a kind of laughter in droplets. Gorlin listened to it the way others listened to birdsong, hearing meanings in tones that most would miss. It was during one of these mornings that he found a note left on the wall near the spiral hall, a simple ribbon of cloth tied gently to a chisel. The thread was elven silk, shimmering faintly even in shadow. He smiled, for he knew what it meant. Someone had listened deeply and left a thank you, woven in silence. In the weeks that followed, small tokens began to appear. A carved wooden bird left on a stone bench, a poem etched in dwarvish script so fine it looked sung into the wall rather than chiseled, a child's drawing of a cave that glowed like starlight. Gorlin never spoke of these offerings, never removed them. They belonged to the echoes now, gifts given to the stone as though it were alive, which in its own way it was. Each gift was absorbed by the halls, deepening the resonance, thickening the hush. Even the air felt fuller, softer, more sacred. One evening, as candlelight flickered along the corridor curves, Gorlin walked to a chamber he hadn't entered in years, his father's old forge. Dust had settled thick, but the air still held warmth, a ghost of embers. He sat where his father once sat, calloused hands now his own. He struck a single note on the wall, not loud, just a tap, and waited. The reply came slowly, round and low, like a voice aged in time. Not words, just presence. He let it settle into him, breathing it in as if it were steam from a winter hearth. The forge no longer held fire, but it still held memory. Outside, the sky shifted toward twilight. The mountain animals hushed. Even the wind paused as if listening. Gorlin stood on the threshold of his halls and looked out across the snowy peaks. Somewhere far below, valleys bloomed green again. But here, at this height, time still moved slowly. He did not fear it. Time, like sound, had its own curves, its own echoes. And in every one, there was room to rest. That night, he slept not in his bed, but in the cradle chamber, the spiral room shaped like a lullaby. He lay on the stone floor, wrapped in furs, surrounded by hums too soft to name. The walls vibrated with dreams not his own, and yet he felt known by them. They held him like memory, like a whisper that forgets nothing, and as his breathing slowed, he felt the whole mountain breathing with him, in rhythm, in quiet, in peace. In the days that followed, Gorlin began carving less, not because he had grown tired, but because the echoes had begun carving themselves. He would wake to soft notes lingering in newly formed alcoves he didn't recall shaping, resonances forming where none had been tuned. It was as if the mountain had learned his language and now spoke back in its own. The stone had grown wise through listening, just as Gorlin had, and now, together, they composed in silence. One morning, he discovered a new corridor, a narrow passage that curved like a question mark, ending in a hollow with walls so smooth they shimmered in lamplight. At its heart sat a single stone, round and pale, humming faintly with no wind to stir it. When Gorlin placed his hand upon it, he heard something he hadn't expected, his own voice, young and hopeful, echoing a word he hadn't spoken in decades: home. Not just as a place, but a feeling, a vibration that lived in the bones and hummed beneath the skin. He sat in that room for hours, no tools, no fire, no movement, just breath and stillness. Around him, the stone softly echoed his breathing, not in mimicry, but in harmony. It was like resting in the arms of something older than time. There were no dreams that night, only the deepest kind of sleep, the sleep that drifts beyond memory, beyond sound, into the hush where beginnings wait. As seasons passed, the mountain welcomed pilgrims more often. They came alone or in pairs, speaking little, offering small tokens, and receiving no guidance but silence. And yet, each found their way to the chamber that hummed for them. Some stayed an hour, others a night. One old elf, nearly blind, stayed for a week, sketching patterns of sound in charcoal on old parchment, murmuring, "Your mountain sings in chords forgotten by daylight." Gorlin only smiled and brought him tea. Then, one night, as stars glowed pale above the craggy peaks and frost danced along the lantern glass, Gorlin felt a presence beside him. Not stone, not echo, but a warmth that didn't belong to fire. He turned but saw no one. Still, he felt held as if by arms made of memory and dusk. The chamber hummed without wind. His heart slowed, softened, and from somewhere deep within the stone, a voice older than him, older than mountain, sang, not in words, but in tone, a tone that said, "Rest now, you've carved enough." The next morning, frost painted silver runes across the walls, shapes that resembled old dwarven lullabies, soft arcs and loops that once adorned cradle songs. Gorlin traced them with his fingers, smiling faintly. He didn't remember carving them, and yet they felt like his. Or perhaps they belonged to the echoes now, shaping themselves into stories. The mountain, it seemed, had learned not only to hum, but to dream. Outside, snow began to fall again, not heavy, but in soft spiraling flakes that kissed the stone and vanished. Gorlin stepped into the quiet, his breath fogging gently in the stillness. All around him, the world felt wrapped in wool and candlelight. No sound but the hush of snow on snow. And far below, barely audible, the mountain's breath, slow, steady, soothing. He walked the ledge path, not to go anywhere, but to feel the cold on his cheeks and the rhythm beneath his feet. The sky stretched pale above him, and it seemed for a moment like the whole world was listening. That evening, by firelight, Gorlin opened his old notebook. Its pages were yellowed and curled, the charcoal lines soft from time. He flipped past drawings of echo chambers, of sound spirals and chisel markings, and paused on a blank page. He set his hand upon it and let it rest. No writing came, no sketch, just the warmth of his palm against paper, a quiet imprint. Some stories, he realized, were not meant to be drawn or told. Some lived only in the air, in the walls, in the hush between heartbeats. As night deepened, the flicker of flames played across the stone, and the chambers settled into stillness. The visitors were gone. The tools were quiet. The only sound was a single low echo circling at one of the oldest rooms, an echo that had started with his first chisel tap all those years ago. Gorlin lay on a bed of moss, eyes half closed, listening to the resonance wrap around him like a well-worn cloak. In this moment, there was no before or after, only now, only breath and stone and the spaces in between. And somewhere beyond the sleeping mountain, far from its quiet heart, winds rushed over distant peaks and rivers sang through hidden gorges. But here, in the echo halls, the world turned slowly, like a lullaby drifting across time. Gorlin's eyes closed, not from weariness, but from peace. He had become the silence he once shaped. And in the hush that followed, the mountain sang a song only he could hear. Days passed gently, as if time itself were walking barefoot through the halls. Gorlin rose when the mountain stirred and rested when its hum lowered, his life now tuned to the rhythm of stone and silence. The world outside might change, empires rise, forests fall, but inside these caverns the same tone endured, steady, warm, eternal. Some mornings, he would sit for hours by a wall and say nothing at all, letting his thoughts drift with the echoes until they no longer felt like his. The mountain didn't ask for action. It only asked for presence. One dusk, a soft knock echoed from the entrance passage. Not loud, but full of purpose. Gorlin answered to find a young dwarf standing nervously, holding a wrapped bundle. Her name was Lyra, and she had heard stories of halls that sang. Her father had spoken of them in bedtime tales, though he'd never found them himself. She held out a tuning fork, simple, hand-forged, and slightly bent. "Can you help it find its note?" she asked. Gorlin smiled and beckoned her inside, no words needed. Together, they walked through the sound spirals and singing chambers. Gorlin showed her how to feel tone, not just hear it, how to sense the low thrum beneath the ribs, the shimmer that danced along the fingertips. Lyra struck her tuning fork gently, and it rang out, a bit wild at first, uncertain, but as she passed through each chamber, its notes softened, rounded, aligned. By the time they reached the heart of the mountain, it sang in harmony with the walls. She gasped. "It sounds like it belongs." Gorlin nodded. "So do you." She stayed for many days, learning the patience of silence, the language of breath and stone. Sometimes they carved together. Sometimes they just listened. Lyra had a gift for tuning air with small touches. She could reshape a corner with the tilt of a stone, redirecting sound as if painting with wind. Gorlin watched her with quiet pride, knowing the mountain would outlive him, but not his work. It would live on in her hands, in the rooms she would shape, in the echoes she would leave behind. And one night, as they sat near the obsidian shard in the deep hollow, Gorlin closed his eyes and heard not his own voice, but Lyra's, not in speech, but in tone, bright, calm, curious. It wrapped around him like a promise. The mountain had chosen another listener, another keeper of its quiet songs, and in that realization, Gorlin felt something shift within him, not an ending, but an exhale. He had passed the note forward, and now he could rest a little deeper in the hush he had helped create. The seasons cycled again, brushing the mountain with snow, then sun, then rain. Lyra remained, her presence becoming as natural as the humming stone itself. She moved through the halls with quiet confidence now, reading the tremble of each corridor like lines in a book. Gorlin stepped back more often, content to simply observe, to sip his mountain tea near the warm hearth and listen to the new music forming beneath her footsteps. His hands, though slower now, still found stone on occasion, but the urgency had faded. What was left was joy. Visitors continued to arrive, though fewer now, and always quietly. Some brought stories, others brought silence. One traveler, a harpist from Rohan, said the halls reminded him of the silence before a song, a sacred hush that makes the first note matter. He played a few strings while sitting in a sound-bowled chamber, and the walls answered softly, cradling the music like breath. When he left, he bowed to the stone as if to an old friend. "Your echoes are wiser than most kings," he whispered. That night, Lyra added a new chamber, small and low, shaped like a curled leaf. She tuned it not with chisels, but with softly stacked stones and a trickling stream she redirected through a carved channel. The sound it made was not loud, but endlessly gentle, like a stream whispering bedtime stories to moss. Gorlin sat in the entryway, eyes closed, and let the sound curl around him. He felt time ripple backwards and forwards all at once. He felt young and very old, and not at all concerned with either. Later, by candlelight, Lyra and Gorlin shared dried berries and a few pieces of honeyed bread. No words passed between them for a long while, only the crackle of fire and the soft ring of a tuning stone cooling nearby. At last, Gorlin said, "You've made the mountain lighter." Lyra smiled, tilting her head. "I think it's always been light. It just needed someone to remember." He nodded. The silence after that felt full, not empty. A silence that held meaning like water holds the shape of a hand. That evening, as the stars blinked above the peaks and the wind kissed the upper ridges, Gorlin stood at the entrance of the first chamber he had ever carved. The stone was smoother now, softened by time, and listening, he ran his fingers along the curve, and the wall sang back, a deep, familiar note. It had changed. So had he. But the echo was still true. As he turned to go, the tone lingered behind him, gentle and proud, like the farewell of an old friend. Winter arrived quietly that year, like a blanket gently unfurled across the mountain shoulders. The air grew still, the snow deepened, and the halls inside grew warmer by contrast, lit with firelight and lined with soft moss blankets gathered in late autumn. Gorlin moved more slowly now, his steps deliberate, his hands curled with age. Yet he was never alone. The echoes walked with him, answering softly each time he passed, like familiar voices greeting him with care. It comforted him to know the mountain remembered him not just in stone, but in sound. In those colder months, Lyra began carving a chamber not for resonance, but for rest. It was round and low, filled with woven mats and tucked-in lanterns, and in its center, a suspended stone disk that hummed gently when one lay beneath it. Visitors who stayed there said their dreams were clearer, kinder, as if they'd been gently combed smooth. One young elf awoke after a night there with tears on her cheeks and whispered, "I heard my mother's laugh again." Gorlin and Lyra said nothing, only smiled and offered her warm tea and honey. As the snow grew deeper outside, the inner halls felt ever more alive. Icicles at the mouth of the mountain acted like tuning forks, catching wind and singing it softly inward. The halls shimmered with their glassy tones, delicate and fleeting. Gorlin loved those moments best, when the music came from outside, shaped by nature, and the halls simply listened. He began to spend longer hours near the entrances, bundled in fur, letting the sounds of snowmelt and drifting frost form little lullabies with no name. Every sound a guest, every silence a friend. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in lavender and silver, Gorlin sat beneath a large quartz archway, gazing up at the stars through a skylight he and Lyra had uncovered seasons before. "We shape echoes," he said softly, "but perhaps they shape us more." Lyra, beside him, simply nodded, her hands resting on her knees, palms up, an old listening posture she'd developed herself. The silence around them deepened, not empty, but whole. A kind of sacred hush fell over the chamber, as if even the stars above were pausing to listen. That night, Gorlin dreamed not of stone or wind, but of warmth, of candlelight flickering across familiar walls, of soft voices sharing stories in low tones, of music that asked for nothing but stillness. He saw the chambers lit in golden hues, not empty, but filled with peaceful dreamers. And from the farthest, deepest room, a sound rose, not a chisel tap, not an echo, but a heartbeat, steady, calm, and beautiful. He woke slowly, smiling faintly, the sound still echoing in his chest like a gentle, endless song. As the days lengthened and a hint of spring stirred in the air, the halls began to shift again. Meltwater trickled down unseen channels, and the stone, warmed by sun and fire, seemed to loosen its breath. Lyra began crafting tiny wind doors, slim slats carved with leaf-like curves that opened and closed with the breeze. They whispered when the air passed through, like faraway flutes or the sigh of an old lullaby. Gorlin sat nearby each day listening, eyes half closed. "The mountain's learning to whisper back," he said once, almost to himself. In the central hall, a visitor from the southern coasts left behind a gift, a pouch of sun-dried sea glass and a poem carved into driftwood. The glass, when placed in small alcoves, caught the firelight and shimmered like sleeping stars. The poem read, "Not all echoes need to come from stone. Some live in the way light falls on stillness." Gorlin carried the driftwood with him often, resting it beside him as he carved or listened. It was true. Echoes were not just sound. They were presence, memory, pause. They were what lingered after something meaningful had passed through. One day, while tuning a newer chamber, Lyra paused and asked softly, "Gorlin, when did you first hear the mountains speak?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Before I carved anything, I was just a boy lost in the cave, scared and shivering. And then the wind sang through a crack in the wall. It didn't say words, but I understood I was not alone." She nodded slowly, her hand brushing the stone beside her. That understanding had shaped every step since. That moment of being seen by something vast and quiet and kind. Spring arrived fully, with green buds on mountain shrubs and warm breezes threading through the halls. New moss grew on old carvings, softening their edges. Lyra placed tiny copper bells at thresholds, not to ring loudly, but to shimmer with faint tones when visitors passed, like blessings you don't notice until you're far down the corridor. Gorlin loved them. "They remind me of memories we didn't know we made," he said. "Faint, beautiful, and always just behind us." And the mountain, now fully awake, seemed to hum in agreement. That night, as the stars returned to their slow, ancient patterns and the wind settled into a steady breath, Gorlin sat in silence once more. He had said so many things over the years, shaped so many walls. But now he found his joy in saying less, letting the stone speak, letting Lyra guide. He closed his eyes and leaned back against a smooth, echo-tuned wall, the low hum beneath his shoulders, like a cradle. The chamber didn't echo his breath anymore. It matched it. One slow exhale, then another, as if they had become one. Time, ever gentle in these halls, began to wrap itself in golden quiet. Gorlin moved more seldom now, his days slower, his nights longer. He often sat by the chamber of first sound, where his earliest carving still sang in faint tones when touched by breeze. Lyra brought him warm drinks in carved mugs, spiced with dried root and clove, and together they sat with silence like an old friend between them. "You've made the mountains softer," he whispered to her one evening. She smiled and leaned her head against the stone. "No," she said gently, "you just helped it find its voice." On the eve of the spring equinox, a gentle gathering formed. A small circle of visitors, elf, dwarf, even one human bard, sat in the main chamber with candles in hand. Lyra had invited them quietly, each chosen for their listening hearts. There were no speeches, no fanfare, only stillness, and then the slow sharing of echoes. One by one, they struck soft notes on the chamber walls, each pitch resonating into the next, like threads weaving a tapestry of memory and tone. Gorlin watched from a carved bench, wrapped in a moss-lined shawl, eyes glistening in the firelight. That night, as the wind flowed through the high corridors and made the tuning stones sing, Gorlin dreamed of the river chamber, not as it was now, but as it might become. He saw Lyra's future work, water-guided tones, gentle pulsing rhythms that mimicked breath and heartbeat. He saw her laughing, chiseling beside apprentices not yet born. The halls were filled with warmth, not only from firelight, but from belonging. He felt no sadness, only a deep peace, like a song whose final note had settled perfectly into place, needing no more. Days grew brighter, and Lyra's hand stayed busy. She began teaching small groups how to hear before they shape, how to sit in silence until the right tone revealed itself. They called it stone listening, and it became the first tradition of the echo halls. Visitors carried the practice back to distant cities. Some built quiet places in their homes. Others began to hum softly to stones they passed on forest paths. The world, in its quiet corners, began to listen a little more closely, and in that stillness, Gorlin's legacy traveled farther than sound. In the soft hush of one late afternoon, Gorlin lay down in the rest chamber beneath the suspended stone disk. The tone above him sang low and slow, a cradle of sound. Lyra placed her hand on his chest and felt the echo inside him, steady and calm. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The stone above vibrated gently, mirroring each breath until breath and echo became one. And when the final breath left him, it did so without weight or fear. It simply drifted upward, carried on sound, into the mountain's endless singing stillness. The halls did not mourn in the way the outside world might expect. There were no cries, no sharp grief. Instead, a stillness settled in, deeper than before, as if the mountain itself held its breath in reverence. Lyra lit a single lantern beside the resting chamber and let it burn for 3 days. The flame flickered gently, casting soft shapes that danced across the stone walls. Visitors came and went, not speaking, only listening. Some sat in silence. Others placed small stones near the door, offerings of sound not for the ears, but for the heart. In the quiet that followed, Lyra worked with even more tenderness. She preserved Gorlin's bench with carved runes that hummed when touched. She tuned a new echo bowl in his name, its walls singing with the low, rich tones he had always favored. A new tradition took root gently. Before carving, each visitor now placed their palm against the warm stone of Gorlin's bench and waited until they heard their own heartbeat echoed back. Some said it took only seconds. Others waited longer, but all left with a quiet sense of being heard. Time moved softly forward, like snow melting down sun-warmed paths. Lyra found comfort not just in carving, but in tending. She tended the moss that lined the old corridors. She tended the tuning forks that hummed at the entrances. And most of all, she tended the listening, encouraging others to sit in stillness, to hear before acting, to remember that sound, like love, echoes long after the voice is gone. The halls became gentler with each passing year. Some said even the mountain's bird song changed near the echo entrances, as if softened by memory. Seasons came and passed like deep, slow breaths. Children who had once visited with their parents now came on their own, leaving small gifts, shells, feathers, handwritten notes pressed between the stones. Lyra began writing too, not to teach, but to remember. She wrote of Gorlin's hands, his silences, his laughter, and the way he listened even to the space between sounds. She placed the pages in sealed stone scroll tubes tucked into alcoves shaped like open palms. "For those who need a story," she'd whisper as she slid each one into place. And the mountain, it continued to breathe, to hum, to cradle every step, every voice, every moment of stillness shared within its walls. Some said they still heard Gorlin's tone in the deeper chambers, never loud, never sharp, just a faint resonance that lingered in the edges of dreams. Others swore the moss grew softer where he used to sit, as if even the green things remembered. But Lyra never tried to explain any of it. She simply smiled, invited them to sit, and said, "Listen, there's something waiting here just for you." Years passed gently, like ripples across a still pond. Lyra grew older, her steps slower, her silence deeper. But her hands remained sure, her listening keener than ever. She no longer carved to shape sound, but to reveal it, uncovering hidden harmonies that had waited centuries to be heard. In a chamber no one had entered before, she found an ancient seam in the stone that hummed with a low, steady pulse. She did not touch it with tools. She simply sat near it each day, letting its song fold around her like a warm cloak. Visitors continued to arrive, though now they came seeking not just art, but peace. Many had heard stories of the echo halls, of the dwarf who shaped them not with ambition, but with reverence. They came not to speak, but to listen. In silence, they sat on smooth stone benches and closed their eyes. And in that stillness, many wept, not from sadness, but from the relief of being held by something ancient and kind. The mountain did not judge, did not ask. It simply echoed what lay within until the burden no longer needed carrying. One spring morning, a young girl from the lowlands came to the halls with a tiny harp cradled in her arms. She had heard of the echo-sculptors, and though her fingers trembled, she asked to play one note in each chamber. Lyra guided her softly, chamber by chamber, where the girl plucked a single string and let it ring. In some spaces, the sound vanished quickly. In others, it danced on the air for long seconds. By the final room, both were smiling. "You've taught the mountain a new voice," Lyra said. The girl only nodded, eyes wide with quiet wonder. The harp girl returned each year, her music growing surer, her steps more joyful. Others began bringing small instruments, flutes, hollow reeds, wind chimes made from bone or shell. Slowly, gently, a new harmony bloomed in the halls. Not noise, never chaos. Just a delicate balance of human breath and mountain silence, shaped together like water and stone. Lyra called it the slow choir, and she never conducted it. She simply opened the doors, made the tea, and let the echoes become whatever they wished to become. And so the mountain sang, in notes that were never written, in stories never spoken, in the hush between footsteps and the pause before dreams. The echo halls became not just a place, but a practice, a way of being, a reminder that silence is not empty, that listening is a form of love. And in the heart of it all, beneath stone and time, the oldest echo remained, a dwarf's chisel, a wind's breath, and the still eternal hum of belonging. Far beyond the mountain, in cities where no stone whispered and no moss lined the floors, quiet changes began to take root. People began creating still rooms, simple spaces with no talking, just soft textures and dim light. Some placed smooth stones on shelves, others strung gentle chimes above doorways. And those who had once visited the echo halls carried with them something unseen, a steadiness, a breath before speech, a rhythm that matched the deep silence they had once heard. Even in noisy streets, even in crowded homes, the quiet traveled like a blessing. Lyra, now silver-haired and wrapped in a cloak of soft wool and woven symbols, carved less and listened more. She spent long hours in the southern chamber, surrounded by the tools and stones of those who had followed her path. She would hold their chisels in her hands, feel the weight of their choices, and place them gently back in their place. When young visitors came to ask about Gorlin, she would simply say, "He listened with his whole being," and in doing so, taught the mountain to speak. Then she would guide them to the stillest spot and let silence answer what words never could. On the eve of her final winter, Lyra climbed alone to the highest cavern ledge, where the air tasted of stars and the wind came in straight from the night sky. She laid her hand against the stone and spoke one word, softly, so the rock might keep it safe. Then she lay down with her back to the wall, feeling the familiar hum beneath her spine. Snowflakes drifted in through the archway, catching in her hair like silver dust. And as her breath slowed, a single low note echoed up from the depths, circling her like a lullaby she had always known. The next morning, no one spoke. They simply walked the halls in quiet rhythm, touching the walls, placing small stones in corners, humming barely audible tones into the air. One child whispered, "She's not gone. She's just quieter now." And that became their way, never mourning loudly, never closing what had only shifted. The halls were still open, still singing. New names were carved, new tones discovered, and old echoes honored with soft reverence. The mountain did not end with one life. It deepened, and somewhere far beneath it all, in a chamber without doors, the softest of tones continues to ring, not loudly, not quickly, just one long, slow echo, shaped like a heartbeat, held by stone and passed gently from silence to silence, waiting for the next listener to arrive and hear.